A long time ago, in the heart of Africa, there was a beautiful kingdom called Umuaro. This kingdom was full of life and color. The land stretched far and wide, covered with tall palm trees, green grass, and many farms. Rivers flowed through the kingdom, bringing water to the farms and the villages. The people of Umuaro were hard-working. Every morning, they woke up early to tend to their farms, catch fish, or take care of their animals. The land was so rich that everything grew well. Corn stood tall in the fields, yams filled the barns, and fruits like mangoes, bananas, and oranges were always in plenty. In the village of Ikenna, the women would go to the market every day with baskets full of vegetables, fruits, and grains to sell. The men would go to the farms with their hoes and cutlasses, working under the hot sun. The children played happily, helping their parents with small chores like feeding the chickens or fetching water from the stream. Life in Umuaro could have been perfect because there was more than enough for everyone. But life was not perfect. It was far from perfect. Even though the land gave plenty of food, the people of Umuaro were hungry. Their stomachs growled from morning till night. Their clothes were old and torn. Their homes, made of mud and straw, were falling apart. Mothers worried about their children, who cried because they had nothing to eat. Fathers worried about how they would survive the next day. Even the animals looked sad. Goats, chickens, and cows were thin and weak because there was not enough food to feed them. It was a strange thing. How could a land so rich with food have people who were so poor? The answer was simple. It was because of the king. The king of Umuaro was named King Maduka. He lived in a grand palace at the center of the kingdom. The palace was the biggest building anyone had ever seen. Its walls were painted bright white, and the roof was covered in shiny red tiles. Big iron gates guarded the palace, and tall soldiers with sharp spears stood at the entrance. Inside the palace, there were many rooms. Each room was more beautiful than the last. There were soft chairs covered in fine cloth from faraway lands, large carpets with colorful patterns, and big windows that let in the cool. King Maduka was not always like this. When he first became king, he promised to take care of his people. He said, "I will be a father to all of you. I will make sure no one is hungry. I will make sure everyone is happy." The people believed him and celebrated. They danced in the streets, sang songs, and prayed for their new king. But as time went by, the king changed. He became greedy. He wanted more and more. He raised taxes and forced the villagers to give him the best part of their harvest. When the farmers brought their yams from the farm, the biggest yams went to the king's palace. When the fishermen caught fish, the fattest fish went to the king. When the hunters caught bush meat, the juiciest pieces went straight to the palace. The villagers were left with the smallest, thinnest, and worst parts. The people of Umuaro began to suffer. Mama Chidinma, a widow with 4 children, often cried at night. She worked hard on her small farm every day, but after giving most of her harvest to the king, she had little left for her family. Her youngest child, Ngozi, often went to bed hungry. Papa Emeka, an old man with a limp, could no longer fish as much as he used to. What little he caught was taken by the king's guards. He sat in front of his small hut every day, wondering how he would survive. Even the animals were not spared. Namdi, a young boy with a goat named Ugo, watched sadly as his goat grew thinner each day. He wanted to feed Ugo well, but the little food he had was not enough. Every day, Namdi wished he could change things, but he did not know how. The villagers often gathered under the big baobab tree in the center of the village to talk about their problems. "What can we do?" they asked each other. "The king is too powerful. His soldiers are many, and they have sharp spears. If we complain, they will punish us." The elders shook their heads in sadness. The young ones kicked at the dust in frustration. Everyone felt helpless. King Maduka, sitting in his palace, did not care. He believed that because he was king, he deserved everything. I am the ruler of this land, he thought. Everything here belongs to me. The people should serve me. That is their duty. And so, he continued to take and take, while the people grew poorer and hungrier. But in the village of Ikenna, there lived a woman named Nia. Nia was not like everyone else. She was smart, very smart. People often said, Nia's mind is sharper than a sword. She was known for solving difficult problems. If two people had a quarrel, Nia would find a fair solution. If someone lost something, Nia could help them find it. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, her words were wise. Nia watched everything happening in the kingdom. She saw the villagers suffering. She saw the king's greed. And deep in her heart, she knew that something had to change. Nia did not have much. She lived in a small hut with her younger brother, Obi. Their parents had died many years ago, and Nia had taken care of Obi ever since. She worked hard on her farm, growing cassava, maize, and vegetables. She also wove baskets and mats to sell in the market. But no matter how hard she worked, the king's greed always made life difficult. Still, Nia never gave up. She believed that every problem had a solution, no matter how big. One night, as Nia sat outside her hut looking at the stars, she thought about the king and the villagers. She thought about Mama Chidinma and her hungry children. She thought about Papa Emeka and his empty fishing net. She thought about Namdi and his thin goat, Ugo. She thought about all the people who had no voice, no power, and no hope. And then, an idea began to form in her mind. It was a small idea at first, like a tiny spark. But as Nia thought more and more, the idea grew brighter and stronger. She smiled to herself. The king may have power, she whispered, but I have something he does not have. I have my mind. And so, in the quiet of the night, Nia made a promise to herself. She would find a way to outsmart the greedy king. She would find a way to bring food and happiness back to the people of Umuaro. She did not know how yet, but she knew she would. And with that promise, Nia's journey began. King Makuka's greed was known by everyone in the kingdom of Umuaro. From the oldest elder to the youngest child, people whispered about how selfish the king had become. Every day, his greed grew bigger, just like the pile of food in his palace. It was as if his hunger never ended. No matter how much he had, he always wanted more. The king's palace had so many storerooms filled with food that even his servants could not count them all. There were bags of rice stacked higher than a man's head, baskets of yams that filled entire rooms, and clay pots full of palm oil that stretched from one end of the palace to the other. There were also dried fish, big chunks of smoked meat, and large barrels of fresh water. Fruits of every kind, mangoes, oranges, bananas, pineapples, were stored in the cool rooms of the palace. And yet, the king was never satisfied. Every morning, the king's chief guard, Chiki, would gather the palace soldiers and send them to the villages to collect more food. The villagers dreaded the sight of the soldiers. They knew that when the soldiers came, they would lose whatever little they had. Mama Nkechi, who sold roasted corn by the roadside, would quickly hide some of her corn whenever she saw the soldiers coming. But no matter how well she hid it, the soldiers always found it. They would take the biggest ears of corn and leave her with almost nothing. She would sigh and say, "How can we survive if the king keeps taking everything?" In the village of Ugochi, Papa Chinedu, a farmer, worked hard every day under the hot sun. His farm had the best yams in the kingdom. But every time he harvested, king's soldiers would come and take the biggest yams, leaving him with the small ones. Papa Chinedu would shake his head and say, "The king's stomach is never full." Even the fishermen by the river feared the king's greed. Young Ifeanyi, a fisherman's son, loved to catch fish with his father. But he hated the days when the king's men would come to take the best fish. "Why does the king need all the fish?" he asked his father one day. His father sighed and replied, "Because his greed has no end." The king's greed did not stop at food. He also wanted the best clothes, the finest gold, and the most beautiful things. Whenever traders came from other kingdoms, the king would buy everything that caught his eye. He would use the kingdom's money to buy fine silk from faraway lands, shiny jewels from the mountains, and colorful beads from the rivers. While the king wore new clothes every day, the villagers wore old clothes with holes in them. But the worst part of the king's greed was how it affected the children. Little Chiamaka, a bright-eyed girl from the village of Obina, often went to bed hungry. Her mother, Adeze, tried her best to feed her. But after giving most of their food to the king, there was hardly anything left. Chiamaka would ask, "Mama, why can't the king share some of his food with us?" Adeze did not know what to say. How could she explain to a child that their king, who was supposed to take care of them, only cared about himself? The villagers often gathered to talk about the king's greed. "Does he not see our suffering?" asked Mama Uche. "Does he not hear the cries of our hungry children?" Papa Tunde replied, "He sees and hears, but he does not care. As long as his belly is full, our cries mean nothing to him." The elders nodded in agreement. The young ones clenched their fists in anger. But what could they do? The king was powerful, and his soldiers were many. King Maduka's greed also made him cruel. If any villager dared to complain, the king would punish them. One day, a brave young man named Ebuka went to the palace gates and shouted, "Your Majesty, your people are starving. Please share your food with us." The king heard him and became very angry. He ordered his guards to arrest Ebuka and lock him in the palace dungeon. From that day, no one dared to speak against the king again. But the king's greed did not stop. Every day, he demanded more. The villagers grew weaker and their hope grew smaller. The only person who still believed that things could change was Naya. She watched the king's greed and thought to herself, "A greedy man will always want more, but his greed will also be his weakness." Nia knew that the king's greed was the root of the kingdom's problems. She thought, "If I can use his greed against him, maybe I can help my people." But she also knew that it would not be easy. The king was clever, and his soldiers were always watching. Still, Nia was determined. She whispered to herself, "Even the strongest tree can be brought down by a small axe if you know where to strike." As the days passed, the king's greed became worse. He started demanding food from villages that were far away. His soldiers traveled long distances to collect more food, leaving the villagers with empty barns and hungry stomachs. The people began to lose hope. But Nia's mind was already at work. She was thinking, planning, and waiting for the right moment. The king, however, was too busy enjoying his riches to notice. He laughed as he ate large meals and admired his treasures. He thought, "No one can stop me. I am the king, and everything in this land belongs to me." But little did he know that someone was watching him closely. Someone who was ready to use his greed to bring him down. Nia knew that making the decision to stop the greedy King Maduka was just the first step. Now, she needed a plan. A clever plan. A plan so strong that even the king, with all his soldiers and power, would not see it coming. For days, Nia thought and thought. She walked through the village, observing everything. She watched the king's soldiers when they came to collect food from the villagers. She listened to the villagers' complaints and worries. She paid close attention to every small detail because she knew that even the smallest thing could be useful. One day, as Naya sat under the big baobab tree, Obi came to her and said, "Sister Nia, have you thought of a plan yet?" Nia smiled softly. "Not yet, Obi," she replied. "But I'm close. I can feel it." That night, Nia could not sleep. She lay on her mat, staring at the roof of her hut, thinking. She thought about the king's biggest weakness, his greed. She remembered how the king always wanted more food, more wealth, and more power. And then, like a spark in the dark, an idea came to her mind. Nia sat up quickly. "That's it," she whispered to herself. "The king's greed will be his downfall." The next morning, Nia called Obi and Mama Uche to her hut. She told them about her plan. "I will make the king believe that I have magical powers," Nia said. "I will tell him that I can multiply food endlessly." Mama Uche's eyes widened. "But Nia, how will you do that?" she asked. Nia smiled. "I will not really have magic," she said. "But I will make him believe that I do. And because he is greedy, he will want to have endless food. That will be his weakness." Obi clapped his hands. "That is a brilliant idea, sister," he said. Mama Uche nodded. "Yes, Nia, this plan is clever. But you must be careful. If the king finds out that you are tricking him, he will punish you." Nia nodded. "I know, Mama Uche. That is why we must be very careful." Nia began to prepare for her plan. She spread a rumor in the village that she had magical powers. She told the villagers, "I have found a way to make food multiply without end." At first, the villagers were surprised. "Can this be true?" they asked each other. But soon, the rumor reached the palace. When King Maduka heard about Nia's supposed magic, he was curious. "If this is true," the king thought, "I can have endless food. My granaries will never be empty." The king sent his chief guard, Chike, to bring Nia to the palace. When Chike arrived at Nia's hut, he said, "Nia, the king commands you to come to the palace immediately." Nia nodded calmly. She knew this moment would come. "I am ready," she said. Obi held her hand tightly. "Be careful, sister," he whispered. Nia smiled and whispered back, "Don't worry, Obi. This is just the beginning." When Nia arrived at the palace, King Adewale sat on his golden throne, looking at her with interest. "So, you are the young woman with magical powers," he said. Nia bowed respectfully. "Yes, Your Majesty," she replied. The king leaned forward. "I have heard that you can multiply food endlessly," he said. "Is this true?" Nia smiled softly. "Yes, Your Majesty," she said. "I can fill your granaries with food that will never run out. But it will take time." The king's eyes sparkled with greed. "What do you need to do this?" he asked eagerly. Nia thought for a moment and then said, "I need 1 grain of rice and an empty granary. Every day I will double the grain of rice. It will start small, but by the end of 1 month, your granary will be full." The king frowned. "1 grain of rice? That is too small," he said. Nia shook her head. "Trust me, Your Majesty. Magic works in mysterious ways." The king, desperate for endless food, agreed. "Very well," he said. "You will start tomorrow." Nia left the palace with a smile on her face. She knew that her plan had begun. The next day, Nia placed 1 grain of rice in the empty granary. The king watched closely. "Only 1 grain?" he asked. Nia nodded. "Yes, Your Majesty. Tomorrow it will be 2 grains." The king sighed but decided to wait. The next day, Nia placed 2 grains of rice in the granary. The king grumbled, but Nia assured him, "Be patient, Your Majesty. Magic takes time." Each day, Nia doubled the grains. 4 grains became 8. 8 became 16, and so on. At first, the king was impatient. "This is taking too long," he complained. But as the days passed, the amount of rice grew larger and larger. Soon, the granary began to fill up quickly. The king's greed grew even bigger. "Soon, I will have endless food," he thought happily. Nia knew that her plan was working, but she also knew that the most important part was yet to come. As the month neared its end, Nia told the king, "Your Majesty, the magic is almost complete, but there is one last thing. If you do not share this food with your people, it will vanish overnight." The king's smile faded. "What? Vanish?" he asked. Nia nodded. "Yes, Your Majesty. Magic does not work well with greed. If the food is not shared, it will disappear." The king was shocked. He did not want to share, but he also did not want to lose all the food. And so, Nia's clever plan set the stage for what would come next. Nia's plan had begun, but she knew that for it to succeed, she needed everyone to believe in her magic. She needed the villagers to believe it, and more importantly, she needed the king to believe it. Nia understood that the strongest weapon she had was not magic, but the power of belief. If people believed she had magic, then it would become real in their minds. The day after her visit to the palace, Nia walked through the village with a calm and confident smile on her face. Everywhere she went, people whispered about her visit to the king. "Did you hear?" asked Mama Ifunanya. Nia went to the palace. "They say the king believes she can multiply food with magic." Papa Chinedu nodded. "If anyone can do it, it's Nia," he said. "She is the smartest person in our village." Even the children whispered about it. Young Chinelo asked her friend, "Do you think Nia really has magic?" Chidinma replied, "I don't know, but I hope she does. Maybe we will have food soon." Nia knew that rumors spread fast, and she wanted the rumor of her magic to grow even faster. She visited the market and spoke to the traders. "Magic works slowly," she told them, "but when it is ready, it is powerful." The traders, excited by the thought of endless food, quickly spread the word. Soon, the entire kingdom was buzzing with the news. Even the king's palace was filled with talk about Nia's magic. Obi, Nia's younger brother, watched his sister with admiration. "Sister Nia," he asked, "why are you telling everyone about your magic?" Nia smiled and said, "Obi, when people believe in something, it becomes powerful. The king is greedy, and his greed will grow when he hears everyone talking about my magic. That will help my plan." Obi nodded, even though he did not fully understand. He trusted his sister and knew she was always thinking ahead. As the days passed, the rumor grew bigger and bigger. People from other villages came to Ikenna just to see Nia. They wanted to catch a glimpse of the woman who could perform magic. Some even brought small gifts, hoping that Nia's magic would bless them too. Mama Uche watched all of this with a smile. She knew that Nia's plan was working. One evening, as Nia sat outside her hut, Mama Uche joined her. "You are clever, Nia," Mama Uche said. "The king will not know what is coming." Nia laughed softly. "Mama Uche, the king's greed will blind him. He wants more food, and that will be his weakness." "But what if he becomes suspicious?" Mama Uche asked. Nia nodded thoughtfully. "That is why I must be careful. I must make sure that he believes in my magic until the very end." Back at the palace, King Maduka could not stop thinking about Nia's magic. Every day, he asked his chief guard, Chike, "What is Nia doing now? Is the food growing?" Chike, who had heard all the rumors in the village, replied, "Your Majesty, the villagers believe in her magic. They say she is very powerful." The king's greed grew with every passing day. He imagined his granaries filled with endless food. He imagined never worrying about running out of rice, yams, or meat. He thought about how other kingdoms would envy him. I will be the greatest king in all of Africa, he thought proudly. But Nia knew that the king's greed would only grow if she made him wait. She remembered something her father once told her when she was a little girl. When people are desperate for something, they will believe anything. Nia decided to make the king wait longer. Each day, she placed the grains of rice in the granary, doubling them as she promised. But she also made sure that the counting was slow. She told the king's men, "We must count every grain carefully. Magic must not be rushed." The king, impatient but greedy, agreed. "Yes, yes," he said. "Count them carefully. I want all the food." The villagers, meanwhile, began to feel hopeful. If Nia's magic works, they said, we will no longer be hungry. But Nia knew that the hardest part of her plan was still ahead. She whispered to herself, "This is just the beginning." One morning, the king sat on his golden throne, tapping his fingers on the armrest. His servants stood quietly around him, afraid to speak. They could see that the king was deep in thought, and when the king was thinking, it usually meant trouble for someone. Finally, the king called out, "Cheek." The chief guard, Cheek, quickly stepped forward and bowed. "Yes, your majesty," he said. "Bring Nia to the palace," the king ordered. "I want to speak to her." Chike hesitated for a moment. "But your majesty, Nia is already working on the magic. Should we disturb her?" The king's eyes narrowed. "Are you questioning me, Chike?" he asked in a cold voice. Chike quickly shook his head. "No, your majesty. I will bring Nia at once." Cheek left the palace and gathered a few soldiers. Together, they made their way to the village of Ikenna. As they walked through the villagers watched them with worried eyes. "Why are the king's soldiers here again?" they whispered to each other. "Has the king come to take more food from us?" When Chike reached Nia's hut, he knocked loudly on the door. Nia opened the door and saw the soldiers standing there. "Nia," Chike said, "the king has summoned you to the palace. You must come with us." Nia nodded calmly. She had expected this. She knew that the king's greed would not let him wait much longer. "Give me a moment," she said. Nia went inside and spoke to Obi. "The king has called me to the palace," she said. Obi's eyes filled with worry. "Be careful, sister," he whispered. "The king is dangerous." Nia smiled and hugged her brother. "Don't worry, Obi. I have a plan." Mama Uche, who had come to check on Nia, also looked concerned. "Nia, remember to stay calm," she said. "The king is clever, but you are cleverer." Nia nodded. "I will be careful." Nia followed Chike and the soldiers to the palace. As they walked, Nia noticed how quiet the village was. Everyone watched her, wondering what would happen next. Some villagers whispered, "Nia is brave. She is the only one who can face the king." When Nia arrived at the palace, she stood before the king. King Maduka looked at her carefully. "So, Nia," he said, "you have promised me endless food. But I am growing impatient. Why is it taking so long?" Nia bowed respectfully. "Your Majesty," she replied, "magic is like planting a seed. You cannot rush it. If you rush, the magic will not work." The king frowned. "I do not like waiting," he said. "I want my food now." Nia thought quickly. She knew she had to calm the king's impatience. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "great magic needs time. But I promise you, when it is done, you will have more food than you can ever imagine." The king's eyes lit up. "More food than I can imagine?" he repeated. "Yes, Your Majesty," Nia said. "But you must trust me. If you give me time, you will have all the food you desire." The king leaned back on his throne and thought for a moment. His greed was stronger than his impatience. "Very well," he said. "But I will be watching you closely, Nia. Do not disappoint me." Nia nodded. "I will not, Your Majesty." As Nia left the palace, she felt a mix of relief and worry. She had bought herself more time, but she knew that the king's greed would not let him wait forever. When she returned to the village, Obi ran to her. "What did the king say?" he asked. Nia sighed. "He wants his food quickly, but I have convinced him to wait a little longer." Mama Uche nodded. "You did well, Nia, but be careful. The king is dangerous when he does not get what he wants." Nia knew that the hardest part of her plan was still ahead. She whispered to herself, "I must stay strong. The king's greed will be his downfall." The days passed, and the grains of rice in the king's granary continued to double. From a handful of grains, it grew to a small pile. Then the pile grew larger, but still, it was not enough to fill the granary. King Maduka, who was known for his impatience, began to grow restless. "Nia promised me endless food," the king grumbled. "Why is my granary still not full?" Chike, the chief guard, replied carefully, "Your Majesty, the grains are doubling every day. Soon, the granary will be full." But the king was not satisfied. "Soon is not good enough," he shouted. "I want my food now." Nia knew that this moment would come. She had expected the king to become impatient, and she had prepared for it. She needed more time for the grains to grow. So she came up with a clever plan to delay the king without making him suspicious. The next morning, when Nia arrived at the palace to add more grains of rice to the granary, the king called her to his throne. "Nia," he said, "why is this taking so long? My granary is still not full." Nia bowed respectfully. "Your Majesty," she said calmly, "the magic is working, but to make sure the magic is perfect, every grain of rice must be counted carefully." The king frowned. "Count every grain?" he asked. "Why?" Nia smiled gently. "Your Majesty, magic is delicate. If even one grain is missed, the magic will fail. We must count each grain every day to make sure that the magic is growing properly." The king, who did not understand magic but wanted his food, thought for a moment. "If counting the grains will make the magic work, then do it," he ordered. Nia nodded. "Thank you, Your Majesty. But counting the grains will take time. We must be patient." The king sighed but agreed. "Very well," he said. "Count the grains, but do it quickly." Nia knew that counting the grains would take time, and that was exactly what she needed. Each day, as she added more grains to the granary, she and the king's guards spent hours counting every single grain. What should have taken minutes now took many hours. Cheek, who had to oversee the counting, grew tired. "Nia," he said one day, "why do we need to count every grain? This is taking too long." Nia smiled. "Because magic must be perfect," she replied. "If we are not careful, the magic will fail." Cheek sighed. "The king is not patient. Be careful, Nia." But Nia knew that the counting was part of her plan. The longer they counted, the more time the rice had to double. Soon, the grains grew from hundreds to thousands, and then to tens of thousands. But still, the granary was large, and the rice only filled a small part of it. The villagers, who heard about the counting, were confused. "Why is Nia counting the grains every day?" Mama Ifunanya asked. "Isn't magic supposed to be quick?" Papa Chinedu replied, "Maybe Nia knows something we don't." Obi, who believed in his sister, said proudly, "Sister Nia is the smartest person I know. She has a plan." Nia's clever delay continued, and each day, the king's impatience grew, but his greed kept him waiting. He thought to himself, "If I must wait to have endless food, then I will wait." Nia, knowing that time was her greatest weapon, whispered to herself each night, "Soon, the king will see the truth." As each day passed, the grains of rice in the king's granary continued to double, just as Naya had promised. What started as 1 grain on the first day had become 2 grains on the second, 4 grains on the third, then 8, 16, 32, and so on. Although the amount was still small compared to the size of the granary, those who understood numbers knew that something big was coming. But most people, including King Adewale, were growing impatient. The king sat in his grand palace, staring at the granary every day. "Why is it still not full?" he asked Chike angrily. "I thought this girl's magic would fill my granary quickly." Chike, who was also unsure, replied, "Your Majesty, Nia said that magic takes time. Perhaps we need to wait a little longer." The king grumbled. "I do not like waiting," he said. "I am the king. I should have everything I want immediately." Meanwhile, in the village of Ikenna, the villagers were also growing curious and nervous. Each day, they asked Nia, "When will the granary be full? When will the magic work?" Nia, calm as always, replied, "Be patient. Magic grows slowly, but when it is ready, it will be powerful." Obi, who trusted his sister, but also worried, asked, "Sister Nia, what if the king gets angry before the granary is full?" Nia hugged her brother and said softly, "Don't worry, Obi. The king's greed will keep him waiting. He wants more food, and that desire will make him wait." But even Nia knew that time was running out. She had to be careful. She whispered to herself at night, "I must finish this plan before the king loses his patience." Back at the palace, the king gathered his chiefs for a meeting. "I want to know if this girl is really using magic," he said. "It has been many days, and my granary is still not full." Chief Ugo, who had always been suspicious, said, "Your Majesty, maybe this girl is tricking you." The king's eyes narrowed. "If she is tricking me, she will regret it," he said. "But if her magic is real, I will have more food than anyone else." Chief Nkem, who had started to understand what Nia was doing, said softly, "Your Majesty, the magic is doubling each day. Soon, the grains will be too many to count." But the king, blinded by his greed, only thought of how much food he wanted. He decided, "I will give her a little more time, but not too long." As the days passed, the suspense grew. The villagers waited nervously. The chiefs whispered among themselves, and the king grew more restless. But Nia remained calm. Finally, one night, as Nia sat outside her hut looking at the stars, Mama Uche came to her. "Nia," she said, "the king is growing impatient. Be careful." Nia nodded. "I know, Mama Uche, but the time is almost here. Soon, the granary will be full, and then the king will have to face the truth." Mama Uche smiled softly. "You are brave, Nia. The village is proud of you." Nia hugged Mama Uche and whispered, "This is only the beginning. Soon, the king will have to choose between his greed and his people." The suspense was growing, and everyone knew that something big was about to happen. The days turned into weeks, and each day, Nia continued to double the grains of rice in the king's granary. What started as a single grain had grown into thousands, and then into tens of thousands. The counting, which Nia had insisted on, took hours every day. But now, something remarkable was happening. The granary, which once looked empty, was starting to fill up. King Maduka sat in his palace, growing more curious with each passing day. "Chike," he called out, "how many grains of rice are there now?" Chike, who had been overseeing the counting every day, replied, "Your Majesty, there are now millions of grains of rice." The king's eyes widened. "Millions?" he asked, sitting up straight. "Are you sure?" Chike nodded. "Yes, Your Majesty. Each day, the rice doubles. Yesterday, there were over 4 million grains. Today, there are over 8 million. King Adewale leaned back on his throne, rubbing his chin. If this continues, he thought, soon my granary will be overflowing. Nia, who had been waiting for this moment, knew that the final days were the most important. Each day, the grains doubled faster than anyone could imagine. What had started as a tiny amount was now growing into a massive pile of rice. The granary, which was once large and empty, was now filling up quickly. The villagers, who had been doubtful at first, started to believe that something magical was really happening. "Did you hear?" Mama Ifunanya said to Mama Uche. "The granary is almost half full now." Mama Uche nodded. "Yes, and Nia says it will keep doubling every day." Papa Chinedu, who had been worried about the king's greed, said, "If this continues, there will be enough food for everyone in the kingdom." Obi, who was proud of his sister, told his friends, "My sister is the smartest person in the world. She is going to fill the king's granary with magic." But Nia knew that it was not magic. It was simple mathematics. She understood that doubling each day would eventually lead to an enormous amount of rice. She whispered to herself, the king's greed made him believe in magic. But soon, he will learn the truth. As the granary filled up, the king became more excited. He imagined himself sitting on piles of rice, eating as much as he wanted, and never worrying about running out of food. He thought, "Soon, I will have more food than any king in the world." The granary was almost full now, and King Maduka could barely contain his excitement. Every day, he imagined opening the doors of the granary and seeing mountains of rice stacked high. He dreamed of eating his favorite meals every day without worry. But most of all, he imagined the power he would have over the people. "If I have all the food," he thought, "everyone will have to obey me." But Nia knew that this moment was the most dangerous. The king's greed was at its highest, and she had to be very careful. One morning, Nia arrived at the palace as usual. She carried her small bag of rice grains, ready to double them once more. But before she could reach the granary, King Adewale called for her. "Nia," the king said loudly, sitting on his golden throne. "The granary is almost full, and soon I will have more food than anyone in the world. But tell me, what happens when the granary is full?" Nia bowed respectfully. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "when the granary is full, your food will never run out. But there is one important condition." The king frowned. "Condition?" he asked. "What condition?" Nia took a deep breath. This was the most important part of her plan. "Your Majesty," she began, "the magic is very delicate. If the food is not shared with the people, it will all vanish overnight." The king's eyes widened. "Vanish?" he asked, his voice shaking. "All of it?" Nia nodded. "Yes, Your Majesty. The magic is not only about creating food. It is also about kindness and fairness. If the food is kept only for yourself, the magic will break and every grain of rice will disappear." The king stared at Nia, his mind racing. He had worked so hard to wait for this food. He could not imagine losing it all in one night. But I am the king," he said. "Why must I share?" Nia replied calmly. "Your Majesty, magic does not work well with greed. If you share the food with your people, the magic will stay forever. But if you keep it all, you will lose everything." The king leaned back on his throne, deep in thought. He did not like the idea of sharing, but he also didn't want to lose all the food. What should I do? He wondered. Chike, who was standing nearby, whispered, "Your Majesty, maybe it is better to share a little than to lose everything." The king grumbled, but he knew Chike was right. "Very well," he said at last. "When the granary is full, I will share some of the food with the people, but not too much." Nia nodded, hiding a small smile. Her plan was working perfectly. As she left the palace, the villagers gathered around her. "What did the king say?" they asked eagerly. Nia replied, "He has agreed to share the food when the granary is full." The villagers cheered. Mama Ifunanya hugged her children tightly. Papa Chinedu smiled for the first time in weeks. Obi, jumping up and down, shouted, "Sister Nia, you are the best." But Nia knew that the hardest part was still to come. She whispered to herself, "The king has agreed for now. Can his greed stay quiet for long?" The granary was almost full, and Nia's condition had been set. But the story was far from over. But Nia noticed something else. The king's excitement was growing, but so was his impatience. What if he decides to take all the rice before the month is over? She thought. She knew that the king's greed could make him act foolishly. So Nia came up with another clever idea. One day, as she placed the rice in the granary, she told Chike, "The magic is almost complete, but we must be very careful. If the rice is taken out before the full month is over, the magic will break and all the rice will disappear." Chike, who believed Nia's every word, rushed to tell the king. "Your Majesty," he said, "Nia has warned us. If we take the rice out before the month is complete, the magic will vanish." The king's eyes grew wide with fear. "Vanish?" he asked. "No. We must not touch the rice until the month is over." Nia's clever plan had worked. She had bought herself more time. Finally, as the days went by, the granary reached a point where it was almost full. The grains of rice had grown from millions to billions, and soon it would be overflowing. The villagers who had once doubted Nia now cheered for her. "She has done it," Mama Ifunanya said happily. "Soon there will be enough food for everyone." Obi jumped up and down with excitement. "My sister is a genius." But Nia, sitting quietly outside her hut, knew that the final part of her plan was yet to come. She whispered to herself, "The granary is full, but the real challenge is just beginning." The news of the almost full granary spread far and wide. The villagers of Ikenna felt joy like they had not felt in years. The thought of having enough food for everyone made them smile, laugh, and sing songs of hope. But deep in the palace, King Adewale sat alone in his grand room, thinking deeply. He thought about the journey so far, how Nia had started with just one grain of rice, and how each day the grains had doubled until the granary was nearly full. He thought about the villagers, who were now happy because they believed they would finally have enough food. But most of all, he thought about himself. "I am the king," he whispered to himself. Should a king share his wealth with his people? What if they take everything? What if there is nothing left for me? His greed, which had always controlled him, grew stronger. "You have waited for so long," it whispered. "You deserve to keep all the food for yourself." But another thought entered his mind, something he had not felt in a long time. It was the memory of his father, the great King Adewale, who had once told him, "A king's strength is not in how much he takes, but in how much he gives. When your people are happy, your kingdom is strong." The memory troubled King Adewale. He shook his head. "I do not need to give," he thought. "I am powerful because I have everything." But as the days passed, something began to change. Each morning, when King Adewale saw the villagers outside his palace smiling and talking about the food they would soon receive, he felt uneasy. Their happiness made him feel restless. He had always believed that his power came from making the villagers fear him. But now, they did not seem afraid. They seemed hopeful. One day, as the king walked through the palace gardens, he saw a young boy outside the gates. It was Obi, Nia's younger brother. Obi was playing with his small wooden toy goat, laughing to himself. The king watched him quietly. "Why is that boy so happy?" the king asked Chike, who stood beside him. Chike smiled softly. Your Majesty, that is Obi, Nia's brother. He is happy because he believes his sister's magic will bring food to everyone. The king frowned. And this makes him happy? Cheek nodded. Yes, Your Majesty. The people are happy because they believe they will no longer be hungry. The king said nothing and returned to his room. But the image of Obi's happy face stayed in his mind. He thought about the children in the village, children who had cried from hunger, children who had begged for food. Now, they were laughing and playing because they believed they would soon have enough to eat. For the first time in a long time, the king felt something strange in his heart. It was a feeling he did not recognize. Was it guilt? Was it shame? That night, as the king lay in his bed, he could not sleep. He thought about the villagers, the children, and Nia's words. If the food is not shared, it will all vanish overnight. What if the food really disappears? He thought. What if I lose everything? The next morning, the king called Chike to his room. Chike, he said, do you think the villagers deserve the food? Chike, who had served the king for many years, replied carefully. Your Majesty, the villagers have worked hard. They have suffered much. Perhaps sharing the food will bring peace to the kingdom. The king nodded slowly. Peace, he whispered. I have not known peace for a long time. Over the next few days, the king watched the villagers more closely. He saw Mama Ifunanya smiling as she cooked for her children. He saw Papa Chinedu laughing with other farmers. He saw young Chinelo playing with her friends without worry. And every day, he saw Obi laughing and playing happily. The king began to wonder, what if I share the food? Will my people respect me more? Will they love me instead of fearing me? Slowly, the king's heart began to change. The greed that had controlled him for so long started to weaken. He thought about his father's words again. A king's strength is in how much he gives. One evening, the king called Nia to the palace. She stood before him, calm and respectful as always. Nia, the king said, the granary is almost full. Soon, there will be enough food for everyone. Nia nodded. Yes, Your Majesty. King hesitated, then asked softly, do you think a king should share with his people? Nia looked at him carefully and replied, a king is like a tree, Your Majesty. If a tree keeps all its fruits for itself, it will rot. But if it gives its fruits to the people, it will grow stronger, because the people will care for it. The king was silent for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. You are wise, Nia, he said. Perhaps it is time for me to change. Nia smiled gently. Change is not easy, Your Majesty, but it is always possible. As Nia left the palace that night, she felt a sense of hope. She whispered to herself, maybe the king's heart is finally opening. The villagers continued to feel relief, and now even the king began to see the light. But the journey was not yet complete. The story of Nia, the clever young woman from the village of Ikenna, spread far and wide. Even before the granary was completely full, people from neighboring villages had already heard about her bravery and intelligence. They whispered her name with admiration and respect. But for the villagers of Ikenna, Nia was not just a story. They knew her, loved her, and celebrated her every day. Mama Ifunanya often sat outside her hut, telling her children, Chidinma and Ifeanyi, about Nia. She is not a queen, but she is stronger than any queen, Mama Ifunanya would say. She used her mind to help all of us, even when the king was greedy and powerful. Chidinma, who admired Nia more than anyone, asked, Mama, do you think I can be like Nia when I grow up? Mama Ifunanya smiled warmly and hugged her daughter. Yes, my dear. Nia shows us that strength is not always in muscles. Sometimes, strength is in our minds and our hearts. Papa Chinedu, who had worked his entire life as a farmer, found himself talking about Nia every day. When other farmers gathered under the big baobab tree, Papa Chinedu would say, "I have lived many years, but never have I seen someone like Nia. She did not fight the king with weapons. She fought him with wisdom." Papa Emeka, the fisherman, nodded in agreement. Nia has taught us that no matter how powerful someone is, they can be defeated if we use our minds. Even the children of the village adored Nia. Obi, her younger brother, became somewhat of a hero among the children because he was related to Nia. Every day, young Chinelo, Chidinma, and other children gathered around Obi and asked him, "Tell us about your sister again. Tell us how she tricked the king." Obi, proud of his sister, would smile and say, "My sister is the smartest person in the world. She did not fear the king, and now, because of her, we will all have food to eat." But Nia herself did not seek fame or attention. She continued to live in her small hut, working on her farm and helping the villagers whenever they needed her. Mama Uche, the wise elder of the village, often visited Nia and said, "Nia, you have done what many thought was impossible. You have changed our lives." Nia, humble as always, replied, "Mama Uche, I only did what needed to be done. Our people were suffering, and I could not stand by and watch." Mama Uche smiled. "That is what makes you special, Nia. You did not seek riches or power. You only wanted to help." As the days passed, the granary in the king's palace continued to fill. King Maduka, who had once been blinded by greed, now found himself thinking more about his people. He often sat alone in his grand room, reflecting on everything that had happened. "Nia," he thought, "a simple village girl has taught me more than all my advisors ever did." One day, the king called Chaike, his chief guard, and said, "Chaike, when the granary is full, we will share the food with the people." Chaike, surprised by the king's change of heart, replied, "Yes, your majesty, the people will be grateful." The king nodded. "It is time for me to be a better king," he said softly. Back in the village, Nia's legacy grew stronger each day. Parents told their children about her bravery. Farmers talked about her cleverness. Fishermen praised her wisdom. And young girls, like Chidinma and Chinelo, dreamed of becoming strong and smart like Nia. Mama Uche, sitting with Nia one evening, said, "Nia, your story will be told for many generations. Children will grow up hearing about the girl who used her mind to defeat a greedy king." Nia shook her head gently. "I do not need my story to be told, Mama Uche. I only want our people to be happy and fed." Mama Uche smiled. "That is exactly why your story will be told." The villagers began to prepare for the day when the food from the granary would be shared. Mama Nkechi, who sold roasted corn in the market, said, "Soon, I will have enough corn to sell and still have plenty for my family." Papa Emeka, repairing his fishing nets, said, "Soon, I will fish not just to survive, but to enjoy." And the children, running through the village, laughed and shouted, "Nia has saved us." Obi, sitting beside his sister one night, asked, "Sister Nia, are you happy?" Nia hugged him tightly and whispered, "Yes, Obi. I am happy because our people have hope again." The legacy of Nia, the clever woman from Ikenna, continued to grow, and her story was far from over. The story of Nia and King Maduka did not end when the granary was full. In fact, that was only the beginning of a new chapter for the kingdom of Umuaro. Nia's bravery and wisdom changed not only the lives of the villagers, but also the heart of a greedy king. When the day finally came, and the granary was overflowing with rice, King Adewale stood before his people for the first time in many years, not to demand taxes, but to make an important announcement. "My people," the king said, his voice clear but softer than usual, "I have made many mistakes. My greed has caused you great suffering, but one young woman has opened my eyes." The villagers looked at each other in surprise. Was this their king speaking? The same king who had taken their food and made them suffer? The king continued, "Nia, from the village of Ikenna, has shown me that true power is not in hoarding wealth, but in sharing it. Today, I promise you that this food will be shared among all the people of Umuaro. No child will go hungry again." A loud cheer erupted from the crowd. Mothers hugged their children tightly. Fathers clapped their hands in joy. The children danced around happily, shouting, "Nia! Nia! Nia!" Nia, standing quietly among the crowd, felt a tear roll down her cheek. Mama Uche, standing beside her, whispered, "You have done it, Nia. You have changed everything." But Nia, ever humble, replied, "We have done it together." The king kept his promise. The food from the granary was shared fairly among all the villagers. No one went to bed hungry again. Farmers were able to keep their harvest. Fishermen could sell their fish, and traders in the market could feed their families. King Adewale also changed. He no longer hoarded food or imposed harsh taxes. Instead, he worked with the villagers to make the kingdom prosperous. He often called Nia to the palace, not as a subject, but as an advisor. "Nia," he would say, "your wisdom has saved this kingdom. Help me keep it strong." And so, Nia's story became a legend. Parents told their children about the clever young woman who used her mind to defeat greed. Children grew up wanting to be like Nia, brave, wise, and kind. But Nia's message is not just for the people of Umuaro. It is for all of us. Her story teaches us that even in the face of great challenges, one person's courage and intelligence can bring about change. It reminds us that kindness, sharing, and wisdom are the true signs of strength. If you have enjoyed this story, there are many more tales of bravery, wisdom, and adventure waiting for you. Subscribe now to hear more stories that will inspire you, make you smile, and teach valuable lessons. Be part of a community that loves stories as much as you do. Don't miss out. Subscribe today and let these stories live in your heart forever.